Good afternoon. I'm Bonnie Thornton-Dill. I'm Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and it's my pleasure to add my welcome to other welcomes that you received in absentia this morning, I gather. And I'm pleased to be here to join with you in this thoughtful celebration of 70 years. Since its formation in 2006, the Gildenhorn Institute has focused on research and study of Israel and has provided transformational leadership on campus and nationally through its course offerings and dynamic programming. Three things, I think, distinguish this program in Israel Studies. One is its academic and scholarly focus, its breadth so that all aspects of the state are discussed, are brought to people's attention, and are explored fully. So we look at the political, the historical, the cultural, and are not, so many times, a lot of these aspects may be omitted when people are focused just on the conflict, but it has a much broader scope, and that's one of the things I think that distinguishes it. Second is its collaboration. This program collaborates well and widely across the campus. Right now they have courses that are cross-listed with 12 different departments: government and politics, economics, English, history, comparative literature, Arabic studies, Hebrew, sociology, film, Jewish studies, honors. And so they really get the idea that Israel Studies is a multidisciplinary field of study and are drawing students in from a wide variety of fields. My next challenge to you, Yoram, is environmental studies, but we'll get to that. That's for the future. And then the third thing, and maybe this follows on my challenge to you, is that this program is innovative. It was one of the first programs on campus to really introduce the idea of global classrooms with students at Tel Aviv University in Israel and students here at the University of Maryland connected virtually in a course. It has created a lot of important and exciting program, and it has not run away from hard issues. It takes hard issues, but it takes a broad perspective on them. It brings in a number of different points of view and really does what we think education should do best, and that is help inform our students about a variety of perspectives and ways of thinking about issues and ways of approaching them and the perspectives that inform that. And then, of course, it provides wonderful support for students. It has graduate support for fellowships and scholarship support for undergraduate students, and that has also encouraged student participation and engagement and activity in the study of Israel. In fact, that leads to, if I have the right piece of paper, yes, I do. That leads to, speaking of scholarships, I've been asked to present a certificate today to Mia Kaufman, who is this year's winner of the Gildenhorn Minor Scholarship. And that's a scholarship given each year to an outstanding student who is doing a minor in Israel Studies. Mia is majoring in special education. She will be graduating in May of 2020. That sounds like a good round year to graduate in, Mia. And is considering a career in the Jewish professional world. So I want you to acknowledge her, and those of you who are in the Jewish professional world, remember Mia when she comes looking for a job. So we're grateful to the Gildenhorn family, which has endowed this scholarship. Mia, would you come forward? So. So the last thing I want to say is that one of the other things that distinguishes this program, Mia has to run the class. So, and despite Dr. Perry encouraging her to forget class, you're getting a certificate, I said, no, he's teasing you, don't believe him. But speaking of Dr. Perry, I just want to say that that's one of the other things that really distinguishes this program, and that is the visionary leadership of Yoram Perry, who's done many, many things. I cannot take the whole program to tell you about his many accomplishments, but I would say that recently his newest book, Mediatized Wars, just won a prize as the best book of the year by the Israeli Association of Communication. So he continues to keep this program visible around the world, and we're grateful for that. Oh, I have one more thing to do. I'm sorry, I didn't keep reading down the page. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this next panel. Dr. Scott Lesensky has taught and will soon again be teaching in the university's Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies. For the last several years, he served as a senior advisor on Israel, the Middle East, and Jewish affairs in the Obama administration, first at the United Nations and then most recently in Israel. He is a visiting fellow at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies, was a researcher for many years at the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Brookings Institution, and is co-author most recently of The Peace Puzzle, which he has co-authored together with Maryland's own Professor Shibli Telhami. So Dr. Lesensky.
Come on down. What's the American game show from my childhood, not yours? Price is Right. Come on down. You're not here to hear me. You're here to hear our three speakers. Grab a mic. I will say a word or two. I'm not checking my text messages. The man without a watch will use this timer. Thank you. This will be fun. We have big shoes to fill. It's quite a morning. I'll quickly introduce the panel, and then I'll say a few words. I'll abuse the microphone, the chair. I'm a big believer in democracy and open societies, but I love strong-minded and strong-willed moderators. So I'll say a few words. Right next to me, Shaul Kellner is a professor of sociology at Vanderbilt University, expert on social movements. I would say in our academic life and our American Jewish life, one of our foremost experts on the Soviet Jewry movement and how American Jews mobilized and pursued that. It's a bad joke, but he started his career as a speechwriter. We knew each other very well in those years, and now he only puts words in his own mouth. Lauren Holtzblatt, Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt, is maybe I'll embarrass her, but she's has had an amazing career from the pulpit at two of America's, we'll call them for lack of a better word, flagship synagogues. One is Congregation B'nai Jeshurun, which is in Manhattan, in New York, and here in Washington, I almost slipped and said in Israel. Where is Tzion? Here in Washington at Addis Israel, which is an extraordinary institution that many of you probably know a little bit about. I think it's, if I get my statistics right, or my American Jewish history right, it's one of the few, or maybe the only synagogue where a sitting American president has come to give a speech.
Two.
One of only two. What was the other one?
Ulysses S. Grant.
Wow. Obama and Ulysses S. Grant. There we go. No comment. What was that? Professor Sarah Ann Minton, here in the middle. She has a PhD from Cal, as people in Berkeley say to other people who went to other University of California schools, but we'll just say the University of California, Berkeley, but of course it is the original campus. There'll be another California reference in just a minute, you'll see. She teaches at the University of San Francisco, and also a sociologist by training. I want to just do three quick things before we start. They've agreed to take some slices of this puzzle and talk about it, and then we'll do a lightning round or two, and then get everyone's questions. Number one, he's here, so I'll join the dean and also pointing to Yoram, who's the head of the center, but also the whole staff, Paul Sham, Avis, and others, staff, past and present. Dov Waxman was here, I think, in this very seat a little while ago and said, universities are not on fire. BDS is not taking over campuses. Where is Dov? And I'm not going to dispute that, but Dov knows more than anyone, as Yoram and virtually everyone in this room knows, that Israel and university life is complicated, and it's a struggle, and Yoram and his colleagues, but with others as well on this campus, Shibli Telhami, who the dean mentioned, and the university administration, have created a place that really is flourishing, and they follow the principle, the most important principle in Jewish life in the home, which is Shlom Bayit. So it's a campus that I think no one's afraid to enter, and Yoram is deserving of our praise. Rabbi Jacobs, who I hope is still here.
He's talking to Reform students. He's meeting with Reform students.
Good. Next will be Likud MKs, I hope. We'll get to that in a minute. I'll praise him. It's easier when he's not in the room. The first time I met Rabbi Jacobs was actually at a meeting that I organized for Ambassador Susan Rice, who was the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and it was before the UN General Assembly. Here, one of the moments of great anxiety for some in the Jewish world. Some, many. Ehud Barak even called it a tsunami. He said a tsunami is waiting for us in New York. So she met with and unfortunately it was an older audience, so we'll call it the Elders of Zion. And there were two things that I remember. I wish he was here, but he'll, of course, remember the story because he's the star. He very much elevated the whole atmosphere of the meeting, as you just saw in his earlier keynote. First, he did not rush for the chair next to Ambassador Rice. I won't name names because so many of these Elders of Zion names are familiar, but he waited for everyone to get seated. He ended up in the corner. And at the very end, when people were allowed to give their parting comments, rather than a comment, he offered a blessing for the ambassador and the president's health and for the success of our country. And he elevates the discourse without walking away from substance. And that was really a magisterial speech, and I'll connect what he said to Talia Sasson, who is still here, and if she's not, there she is. When I was teaching here a few years ago, I used the report that she wrote on illegal outposts, that she wrote at the request of the Israeli Prime Minister at the time. I think the executive summary, because the report's very long. I used it in my course here as a primary source. Many teachers like to use primary sources so students can read in the original. So it's a primary source that lives on. Unfortunately, the issue that she wrote about is still with us. And I think the speech that most of us heard a little while ago is a wonderful primary source that I know in the fall I'm going to ask my students here at the university to read. And Rick, the last thing I was going to say, it's a joke, but it's a shame he's not here, that I was going to tell him size doesn't matter, because he took us through Lauren missed it, but the 5 cities in the world with the largest Jewish populations, right? Of course, he forgot to mention his own, like the famous Rabbi Rashi. He grew up in a very small place. We grew up on 2 sides of the same divide in Orange County, California. Rick is from Tustin, where a lot of people think Jewish leaders come from. I'm from Irvine. So size doesn't matter. Tustin produced Rabbi Rick Jacobs. All right, quick point of order. We are going to take some slices of American Jewish life. 2 are, I think, easier to understand. 2 are very roll up your sleeves. We're going to look at institutions and philanthropy and foundations. We're going to look at organizational, denominational life, and look ahead. Yoram asked us to look ahead. Aware of the divides that are growing between American Jewry and Israel, or within each community. Where are we headed? What can we do? And third, Sarah Ann will speak less about a particular sector or segment of American Jewish life, but more about whether these divides might serve a purpose. Should they persist? Maybe they should persist. And use her work on narratives to sort of illuminate these ideas. And then we'll do a lightning round or 2 and go to the audience. Shaul, can you speak? Can you start?
Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, no, I can hear me up here. All right. Is Dean Dill still in the room? So thank you. Thank you to Yoram. And just as a gift, Yoram, to respond to the Dean's challenge to build the bridges to environmental studies. Most of the population in Israel lives on the coastal plain. The sea will get pushed into the Jews. And use that as a basis and work with it. Okay, so this session, where are we going? It pushes me beyond my comfort zone in a number of ways as a sociologist. I'm much more comfortable analyzing and describing what I see going on. And predicting the future, that's a lot harder to do. And in some ways, I think that social scientists will often get things wrong because we operate from a principle of present trends continued. And that may or may not be the case. When I look at those who have predicted the future and have done so more creatively and more accurately, I look to the artists to do that. And just as one example, think about Philip Roth's Operation Shylock, which he publishes in the early 1990s. And he introduces there the concept of diasporism and a principled ideological rejection of Zionism as a state-centered ingathering of all the exiles. And Roth, in the satire, had the character who was named Philip Roth make the case for diasporism, the benefits of having Jews scattered around the world. But that which he was doing as art and as literature and as satire, that actually has taken root, and there are political movements that are thinking in those terms now. The other way in which I think that looking forward is challenging. It's challenging for me as a sociologist of American Jews at this moment, because assumptions that I had taken for granted about America, I now have questions about. And all of the prior analyses of American Jewish-Israeli relations were written in basically 2 eras, Cold War era and the post-Cold War liberal order. In both of those moments in history, what was continuous was America as a superpower, stable, a taken for granted assumption of American stability at home, with the exception of 1968 to Watergate, when things I think were thrown into question. And a general fundamental commitment to a liberal narrative of what America is about. And I don't know if the present moment in the States is a blip and we're going to go back to what was before, or if we're at the beginning of a new moment. And when I think about it in terms of the broader global context, and we talked about illiberalism around the world and why the anti-democratic trends in Israel have not been included in that, but you look at what's going on in Hungary and in Poland, and look at Brexit and the like, look at the weakening of the European Union, I think that what we're seeing is bigger than America. And but I'm not going to predict that. We don't know what's going to happen, but it makes it difficult to project forward based on what the present trends are. So those are my caveats that I want to say. When I think about the relationship between American Jews and Israel, I think about it on a number of levels. I think about it on the symbolic level. So I belong to two congregations. I'm a member of an Orthodox congregation and a Reform congregation. Our kids go to Hebrew school at the conservative congregation. We don't have Reconstructionists, but we have the bases covered in Nashville, Tennessee. But in the Orthodox congregation, definitely, and I think in the conservative as well, there are stained glass windows that depict scenes from Israel. There are also stained glass windows that depict Holocaust. And so when I think about Israel as a symbol, I think about the ways in which Israel as a symbol enters into our religious spaces. I think about it in terms of the gifts that the congregation will present to the B'nai Mitzvah. A tree will be planted in Israel. They'll get a gift certificate to go on a trip to Israel. So this gets integrated into ritual life. So there's an aspect of a relationship to Israel that's happening within institutions, and that is about creating symbolic connections, emotional connections, tying it with religious narrative, tying it with life cycle and the like, and importantly, Israel and the Holocaust often together, ashes to redemption. I do think that link makes for a relatively stable relationship symbolically with Israel, unless American Jews lose interest in the Holocaust, which I don't think is going to happen. Israel is not understood on its own. The Holocaust is in there as well as, in a sense, this is what Israel gives hope, doesn't answer or justify, but it gives some type of hope that all is not lost for Jews after the Holocaust. And to the extent that that symbolic narrative persists, then I think that the relationship with Israel in some ways has a certain stability that's built into it. then there's the relationship on the institutional level. And you can think about this in terms of, we've heard about public opinion and demographics, but public opinion gets mediated through Jewish organizations, through philanthropy, through our community relations organizations. It gets mediated through social movement organizations as well. And we have a two-way street here. We have organizations, institutions that try to shape public opinion, and then we have individuals and public opinion that try to shape institutions. We're now in a moment, and I think we've been in this moment for a while, and I'll end with this, where we have a decentralized institutional system. We don't have the federation control of a Jewish community, like we had back in the 1970s, where there was a single address. When the protesters in 1969, the student protesters wanted to make a case to the Jewish community that they should be investing more in Jewish education and they should be investing more in Soviet Jewry, they went to the General Assembly of the Federations because there was one address. Now we have protests, we have, if not now, going to lots of different places, but the question is, if there was one single place where they should go to protest to try to affect institutional change, where would it be? And I don't think that we have that answer now like we used to have. And the philanthropic system is also diversified. Now each foundation is pursuing its particular interests. Where we go will depend on the decisions that all of these different institutions and actors will make, and we can talk more about it as the panel goes on.
Thanks, Shaul. Maybe you can think a bit while we go around about, I'll connect it back to what Dov said, if there's been an overindulgence on issues like, what did you call it, pro-Israelism or countering BDS, and some would argue largely driven by family foundations. Is there, who mediates that? And maybe you can, a dialogue from the stage with Dov in the audience. We're gonna go to Lauren next, but because, I don't know where this came from, but because you brought stained glass into it, I don't know if it's possible, but I hope that Sarah Ann, when we come to her after Lauren, can bring in, because she's from Atlanta, which she just revealed to me at lunch, and the Temple, if anyone's ever been there, anybody? Ever been to the Temple? It's a Reform flagship synagogue in Atlanta, has some of the most stunning and startling and eye-opening stained glass windows that do not transpose Israel into congregational life. It's all about the Americanness, if I remember the stained glass windows, to make sure that everyone on the outside of that synagogue in Atlanta knows that those inside are American. Lauren, how does all this look? How does this divide look from the pulpit?
I was just thinking, we don't have any stained glass at Addis, but the wall behind our bima is reminiscent of Jerusalem stone. So as you know, I was just told that not in Reform synagogues, but in conservative synagogues and Orthodox synagogues, when you pray, you're always facing east towards Jerusalem. And so the heart center of tefillah, of prayer, is towards the east. And I've been thinking about that a lot these days, about both what we, look, for millennia, there have always been different centers of Jewish life that have grown. So we had a center in Babylonia, which is where we get the Babylonian Talmud from, which was in, seemingly Galut, exile, and then there was the center in Jerusalem, which is where we get the Yerushalmi, right? And so you have two major texts of Talmud, which become the codes of Jewish law, or lead into Jewish law, because it's hard to study Talmud and figure out what you're supposed to actually do. But you get incredible conversations about law and about practice. But there are always major centers in multiple places that both included Israel itself and also somewhere in the diaspora. And diaspora meant different things at different times. And I think that's something that's mirrored in today's world, which is that America has become an incredible center of Jewish life and growth. And yet I'm in the firm category of belief, both where I sit as a pulpit rabbi and also I spent 3 years as a campus rabbi at Yale, working with millennials. And the experience of having the state of Israel as a strong center, I think, has meant an enormous amount to Jewish identity for kids growing up now. And while there's a lot of pushback within millennials, there's also an enormous feeling of security to be able to push on something. Whereas I think in different times that might not have been as prevalent. And that's something I think to remember when we think about what's happening on college campuses. The other thing I was thinking about was, there are two concepts that I think within synagogue life, within movement life, I think a reframe, I understand that Rabbi Jacobs spoke a little bit about a reframe earlier. A reframe that I've been thinking about along with my co-rabbi at Addis, Aaron Alexander, is, there's this concept of Eretz Yisrael, which we get from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, and then into the rest of the Tanakh, which has this, although I'll say even in the Torah, Israel is not always, or Canaan is not always an easy place to be, right? As soon as Abraham gets there, there's a famine. So we have this idealized sense of what Israel is, because it's a dream. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. It's the dream of 4 books within the Torah, right? We leave out Breshit, Genesis, because that's sort of the beginning of humanity from the Torah's eyes. But Exodus through Deuteronomy is all about the dream of what the land is going to be and the promise of what the land is going to be. But the truth of it is, when the characters arrive there, it's not always an easy place to be. And so there's the dream, and that's where I think about Israel as this sort of heart center of tefillah. What does it mean to think about what it means to have security, which is something we can touch into now? What does it mean to have a spoken language of our people? Lashon Kodesh is now a spoken language, and that is a miracle, I think, within our time. In Israel, that's turning 70. But then there's also Medina Israel. There's Eretz and there's Medina. And when you get to countryhood, you get to peoplehood, and you get to sovereignty, there are lots of questions that arise about what does it look like to have Jewish power? And how does that change what it looks like, what it has looked like in the past when Jews didn't have power and sovereignty, to what it looks like on the ground now? And I think creates a whole list of sort of religious, civil, ethical questions, political questions. And that's where I think many times the gap grows, because we think about people that I work with in my congregation, and in the movements, oftentimes we're still in this space of dream when we're actually seeing reality, and not being able to figure out what the paradigm is to both have a dream of what we want Israel to be, and also what it means to be human and fallible, and trying this project out, which is a very relatively new project of 70 years of the modern state. And how do we create both places where people can openly talk about that, can live it, can be honest about where they feel, and also part of what I think is one of the solutions of becoming so far, the gap growing so wide, is by being on the ground and building relationships with communities in Israel. What does it mean? What does it mean to be, in our case, in my movement, the conservative movement, Masorti in Israel? What does that look like? What does it look like to have, both an egalitarian view of prayer, and then also to be in the modern state of Israel, which is a very hard thing to do. But how do we sort of grow in our own experience of actually being on the ground in the land with the people?
That's wonderful. If I could just press you a little bit. I was in the synagogue, in your synagogue a few weeks ago. I told you on the phone, and I saw a map in the back where the flyers are of the Masorti movement, and it showed a map with arrows, and I think it's to synagogues, right? And they're sort of all over the country. Just to press you a little bit more, where would, if you were in charge, where would the investment go? On your own or with Israeli partners? Is it schools? Is it synagogues? Is it infiltrating ideas into public life? If you had to choose, and people with money to spend have to make choices, where would you choose that ground game? And thank you for giving us something very concrete. You're pointing to the ground game and investing more in it, but where would you make those investments?
I mean, the truth of it is, if it was me, I think the youth are enormously important, and I think there are two things. I think one is that when you're growing up and you don't see examples of the multiplicity of what Jewish life can look like, then you don't change in your head what the image is of what you could be. And that's why I think synagogues, in my own view, play a very important role. There are many Masorti synagogues within Israel proper right now that have women rabbis. And that's a very big change within the state of Israel. to see that as a kid, to grow up and see women on the bima, women leading, to have multiplicity and diversity within the, although diversity is not so much of a problem in Israel as it is here within Jewish communities. So I would spend it both within growing those movements to have pluralism, not only with Masorti, but also with the Reformim, and having everybody be able to have access to religious pluralism. And I would also spend it in the schools, because I think being able to grow a youth movement feels an incredibly important thing.
Great, thank you. We'll turn to Sarah Ann. We, perhaps throughout this day, certainly when we were on the phone talking the last few days, we talked about this gap, and we, at least I injected the notion, a value notion that there's a problem, the gap is bad. You want it to be, you want to mitigate it, maybe not eliminate it, but soften it. And something we started talking about, which I know Sarah Ann will expand on, is to the extent to which perhaps the gap can be positive or purposeful, or there's a reason for it to persist. So do we necessarily need to conceptualize it as a problem? Sarah Ann?
So thank you so much, and thank you, Yoram, for having me and for having all of us. This is wonderful. Well, the first thing that I'm going to say is which gap? So I'm not so focused in particular on the gap between American Jews and Israeli Jews, but rather gaps among Jews, both here and both there. And those are gaps that I think are quite productive and important. Not always positive, of course, but productive and important. But before I go on, or maybe as a bridge, I do want to talk about stained glass for one moment. The first synagogue in San Francisco is Shereth Israel, a Reform synagogue. And actually, as I'm saying that out loud, I think the people from Emmanuel are ready to claim that they're the first synagogue. And they started together, and then after like one day, they broke off into two. But Shereth Israel...
I gotta say, this is such an East Coast crowd here. As a Californian, I'm loving the references. No one's loving it. Rick's out of the room. What a shame.
Shereth Israel has an extraordinary wall of stained glass. And it is Moses receiving the Torah, receiving the 10 Commandments. Where did he receive the 10 Commandments? You are all wrong. He received them in Yosemite, because that is what is up in the stained glass in this synagogue. So to talk about diasporism, to talk about where are we most at home, this synagogue 100 years ago made a claim. We are at home in California. This is our promised land. It's kind of extraordinary. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to say something about the animating frames or the narratives, the ways that we even think about how we relate to Israel and how we relate to Jews and Jewishness. And I want to say, I'm going to make quickly 3 points. So the first is that we talk about Israel, Jews talk about Israel, not all Jews, but many Jews, and certainly the dominant discourse is about, we talk about it in a language of connection, a language of love. And if you listen to Rabbi Jacob's talk, you heard him again and again talk about the Israel he loves, our beloved country. Lots of people this morning and anywhere you go, will talk about the importance of loving Israel, cultivating love among people for Israel, teaching young Jews, teaching Reform Jews, teaching other Jews, going on birthright in order to learn or to discover how you love Israel. And I think it's really important, A, that we name that we name this idea of love, which we can come back to and continue to unpack. But B, when we think about criticism of Israel, there's a difference in how many of us hear criticism of Israel, whether it's couched in love or it's not. And so if you look at the ways that liberal Zionists will usually critique Israel, they will wrap their critique in love. Natalie Portman wrote on her Instagram feed, "I care about Israel. That's why I made this choice." Or you can look at, for example, any of the statements from J Street or Americans for Peace Now, or many of the more left-leaning groups will say, I do this out of love for Israel. I love Israel, therefore I must speak up. The flip side of that is that we have enormous, actually reflected in that, I should say, is that we have enormous stigmatization of criticism. We stigmatize people who critique Israel. So one thing I want to talk about is what we do with people who don't wrap their critique in love at all, which is that in the American Jewish community, we tend to exclude them. Think about Jewish Voice for Peace. Think about how many people will tell them that they're not even Jews. Okay, you accept that they're Jews, but they're not a part of Jewish community. Why? Well, We can unpack why, but I would argue that one of the main reasons of why is that they don't put first and foremost their statement of loyalty to Israel, loyalty to Jews, which comes out in the form of saying, I do this because I love Israel. What's happening in Israel itself with criticism? Well, Natalie Portman Oren Chazan said, let's strip her of citizenship, right? And he's a joke, it's a joke that he said that, except it's not a joke, as Talia knows only too well, that there is an accusation of critics of Israel, critics from the left, critics who are criticizing Israel for its policies against Palestinians, that they are foreign agents, that they are traitors, that they are not a part of this nation. So we have a kind of parallel here of what happens to people who dissent. They're pushed out of the tent. In Israel, there's the question of citizenship. When Hagai Elad, the director of B'Tselem, spoke at the UN about the occupation, the head of the coalition in the Knesset called for him to lose his citizenship over that move, over his testimony. So we have here a kind of institutionalization, a kind of, in the US it's a little bit softer. You can't strip someone of their citizenship. You still let them come to shul, but you can make them feel deeply uncomfortable. You can prevent certain student groups from being part of Hillel. You can push students out of Hillel. We see this happening across the country with people who criticize Israel in ways that we don't accept, or ways that seem to be too far out of the mainstream. Whereas in Israel, it is more institutional. And one thing I would like to talk about, actually, since BDS came up earlier today, is to actually talk about what's happening in states across the country. Now we actually have a federal law proposed, and each of these laws, 24 states have them, 12 states are considering them now. Each of these laws are ostensibly about protecting us from BDS, but actually they all seem pretty unconstitutional attempts to limit free speech. So which side do we fall down on? Where are you in this? In terms of what's okay for criticism, what do you love more? The last thing I want to say, this also came up a little bit earlier, is that race and racism and the way that we talk about race is another really important discourse, both in Israel and in the US. And in the US, we are obviously in the middle of this incredible national moment, national conversation about race and racism, learning about and thinking about the ways in which African Americans have been systemically dispossessed and face systemic bias and discrimination in criminal justice from police and many areas of our lives. One of the important things to look at in the Jewish world is just to remember and to notice, and for many of us, it's the first time, that Jews are not all white. And we're in this incredible moment of the visibility, the growing visibility of Jews of color. A new population study just came out about the Bay Area where I live that says that a full 25% of Bay Area Jewish households are mixed, meaning that a non-white person, people of color, live together with white Jews in a full 25% of these households. This is an extraordinary number. It's far more than I knew. And why am I bringing this up, aside from the fact that when we talk about Jews, we need to talk about who Jews really are? Well, one is that as the Democratic Party is also shifting demographically, it's also moving further away from Israel. There are connections here that we need to talk about and think about, because when we're thinking and when we talk about Jews being on one side of Israel and people of color being on another, we're erasing Jews of color. We're erasing where they may be. And we're also discounting these coalitions and progressive politics of so many young Jews who see themselves as part of progressive politics happening in the United States right now, see themselves as anti-racist activists, and feel caught and torn between what is being asked of them to stay affiliated, stay apart, stay close to Israel, and also live out their politics in a way that feels true to them. And I'll stop there for now.
Terrific. Thank you. I will connect Yoram's house to Shibley's house, because it was only a few months ago, actually, right here on campus, that Chris Van Hollen, the senator from Maryland, said that he's not ready to support the BDS bill, that his own, if someone correct me if I'm wrong, that his own colleague, Senator Cardin, was offering because he wanted it to both protect Israel and protect free speech. And it was just less than a week ago, that Senator Cardin said the same at J Street, that he wants to make sure it fits. So I'm glad that you raised the point, but those that are advocating it think, hope, and are trying to find a way to serve both, to make it fit with free speech. Anyway, maybe, we'll see. always great discussions at the University of Maryland. And to add to your list, by the way, your earlier list, I know you were being careful about the time, but for those who remember the Israeli elections in 2000, Yoram, of course, will correct me, 2006 or 7, 8, Lieberman's billboards, which were everywhere. No loyalty, no citizenship. So this extends. It's not just within the Jewish world or the Jewish community. It's across. That was a very glaring ad. Today you can do that with less money because you just have to put a banner ad on Facebook. You don't have to actually put up billboards, maybe. Let's do just a lightning round or two before we open up to others. Rick in his speech just now called for a reset, a new paradigm. He wants to redefine how we relate to each other, both in the guise of Israel, American Jewry, but also in this, he gave a whole other framework, world Jewry, sort of conceptualizing us as part of a single community. He didn't lay out all the principles or the parameters. Talia in the morning raised an issue, I think if I remember, from just 5 hours. Does anybody remember what we had for lunch even? But from just 5 or 6 hours ago on this stage, Talia said, listen, she invited American Jewry on questions of identity. She said, sure, come in, you're welcome. Others historically would say, and I know this very well, partly because I work at a National Security Institute in Israel, that, well, okay, security maybe that's a separate issue, issues of identity, something else. Where do you draw the boundaries? There was an amazing exercise probably 60 years ago, early 50s, and then again in 1960-61, an American Jewish leader, Jacob Blaustein, and some people in this room will know the exchange, worked out an arrangement with the Israeli prime minister, a very strong leader, but it was a very different Israel, a weaker Israel, more reliant on external support, but they worked out an arrangement. It's known universally as the Ben Gurion-Blaustein exchange. Observed in the breach, for anyone who knows their American Jewish Israeli history, observed in the breach, but it was a kind of a framework. You're there, we're here, you can do this, you can't do that, don't step over the line. Rick called for a reset and a new paradigm, but one interpretation of his speech would be no boundaries. He said we're going to be part of the discussion, and then he said we need to be part of the, someone fill in, even beyond, the policy, the decisions. So if I go around for the three of you, could each of you come up with just one or two principles? Not the nitty-gritty, but what would be a principle that you would put out that should define a new paradigm of relations within the world Jewish, sort of world Jewry context, or between American Jewry and Israel? What should define this new paradigm? What's allowed, what's not allowed? Anybody want to start? Lauren, you want to start?
I was thinking about respect of identity, and I think I was thinking about it in broad terms. I've had this privilege of being part of the Schusterman Fellowship, which is a fellowship for leaders around the world. There are 30 of us, and I'm in the third cohort, and the fourth cohort is starting. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm teaching at the next cohort next week, and half of the group are Israelis. And my job is to focus on Jewish identity. And when I looked over the questions on sort of mapping your Jewish life, they were all sort of American Jewish centric, right? What has it felt like to build your identity within this particular culture as a minority? And what's really interesting is for the past 4 years, there have been Israelis that have participated every year. But the multiplicity of pluralism that already exists within their own Judaism, of growing up as Stam, like you speak Hebrew and you learn Tanakh within school and you're walking the land, and American Jews having very little understanding of what that means in terms of identity and also pluralism. One of the things Sarah Ann brought up is how pluralism in Israel is sort of, I always think, Israel is pluralistic when you think about culture, when you think about race, and not that there aren't issues there, but I think within the American Jewish community, I think about Addis itself and things we've been thinking about in terms of the integration of our own community, and how do you open your doors and make sure you're really being an inclusive community, that when you teach in certain ways, that when your membership is in certain ways, that you actually have a multiplicity of ways of people entering. And I would say one of the principles, I think, is as a respect of pluralism and a respect of identity, that people have several different doors in which to enter and self-define who they are, as opposed to an Israeli walks in the room and there's a self-definition, or an American Jew walks in the room and there's a self-definition of what that means. And I think seems to me we're living in a beautiful age of multiplicity of identities. And when we're not afraid of that and we can open that up, there's enormous amounts of creativity and innovation that are possible within Jewish life.
Thanks. Shaul, how would you define the paradigm? What are the parameters?
Not for me to set the boundaries, what's in and what is out. But I think I can tell you how I think about the issues. The attempt to enforce boundaries is increasingly difficult. Sarah and Andy might have a different perspective. But I would argue that JVP has created a space for itself, for its community, right? But it's not a single monopolar Jewish community. There is diversity within the community such that we have a much wider range of positions and opinions represented now than we had in the past. In the 1970s, when there really was strong federation dominance of local communities, it created a very cohesive community. It created, in some ways, a boring community because the extremes were lopped off. And so we have much more contention now. I want to...
Sorry, since it's not the classroom, I'll be the benign dictator. I'll press you. You don't want to enforce boundaries? I am Naftali Bennett. I have just said, birthright's not enough. We're going to put more money into American Jewry because we're losing them, whatever the reasons are. We need to subsidize Jewish day school education. This is for those of you who follow, this is the newest thing, the new frontier, in where Israel and the Israeli government is going to enter and intervene and penetrate into American Jewish life. Now, how about when he comes to you, let's say you're a day school principal in Nashville, Tennessee. Is there a day school in Nashville, Tennessee?
There is. I'm past president of the board.
Mr. Past President, when he comes to you and says, we're going to give you $600,000 next year for scholarships, but it's going to come with some strings attached on curriculum, who knows, maybe even on gender or some other ideological, I don't know. What are you going to do? You going to take the money, or will you say no?
You have if in fact Israel has the ability to project power into the American Jewish community. And the American Jewish community, this will go back to your question of pro-Israelism. The American Jewish community may have always been pro-Israel, it's never really been Zionist. If it was actually Zionist, what it would have learned was to take itself seriously as a polity, as an independent political actor. And in that case, it would be able to work collectively to push back or to negotiate. There were moments in American Jewish history when American Jews stood up and said to Israel, we have a different position. So in the movement for Soviet Jews, when there was the whole fight over what the Israelis called nishira, the dropout phenomenon, all these Soviet Jews are leaving, they're going to transit points in Europe, and then by the late 1970s, most of them, like upwards of 90%, are choosing to come to the States, and the Israelis are going ballistic, and they're putting pressure on American Jews to shut that down, to pressure the government to withdraw refugee status, to not fund the Soviet Jewish emigres who were coming here. And American Jews at that moment had a consciousness of themselves as independent political actors, and they said, you have your interest, we have our interest. In the end, American Jews were outflanked, and there is certain state power that can be exercised that the diaspora can't exercise. It may be that in this relationship, that there's a fundamental imbalance, and American Jews can assert independence, but within limits. But on the other hand, when we are asserting diaspora power as an independent actor, that's the moment we're actually imbibing the Zionist message that Jews are a polity. And otherwise, otherwise we're just replicating an old center core periphery model. I disagree with the premise of the question, which is why I'm struggling to
Well, Saul doesn't live in Washington, but that's a very Washington, it's called the redirect. So I want to congratulate you. That's a beautifully done redirect. Thank you. Sarah Ann, do you want to?
Which question?
You know, it's unless you want to just give it back to me, you can comment as you wish on a new paradigm, whether there should be boundaries. Most relationships, whether in the home, between states, between diasporas and homelands, between ethno-national groups that live in, I mean, relationships are defined by boundaries. We have it all around us. I understand that Saul's pointing to a world which we live in, which is kind of a shame. I'll be the old man on the stage without boundaries. The phone can ring at all nights. You can put whatever you want on I mean, Lieberman should be happy. What he probably wasn't allowed to put on the billboard, he can put on Facebook, and no one's going to care, or the Russians will put on Facebook and say it's him. But do you want to just a last word or two about boundaries? Where should they be? How can we live in a world without boundaries?
I don't think anyone's suggesting we live in a world without boundaries. But I will respond to that, and I also want to thank you for pointing out what Lieberman said in that election, because really the first foreign agents inside of Israel are Palestinian citizens of Israel, the people who are never considered a full part of the polity. And it's interesting now, your question is really what should be the new paradigm of relationships between American Jews and Israel, only I think, and maybe I'm wrong, that what you're asking is what should be the paradigm for the relationships between American Jews and Israeli Jews. And I think it's really important that we know who we're talking about. So if we're talking about Jews, then there's one thing. We're talking about Jews and Jewish identity. But if Lauren is doing a program with Americans and Israelis, only there are only Jews in it, then we have a big problem, right? A big problem. And this is a part of where I wanted to go with talking about our growing awareness of what it looks like to be mostly white, mostly privileged American Jews, and to contend with what privilege looks like and what it means to face Jews of color in our communities and look at their life experiences. Similarly, if we're going to have some sort of paradigm of relationship between American Jews and Israel, then I think that we first and foremost need American Jews to get to know the broad expanse of who lives under the control and the authority of the Israeli government. And that means from the river to the sea. Who's living under the power of the Israeli government? What is this reality? Because first of all, when we talk about identity, we leave out Palestinian citizens. And if we were to do that in the US and leave out the 20% of Israel the 20% of Americans who are not something, we would rightly be criticized for that. And secondly, we use the Green Line as a tool for our own identity construction, so that we can pretend that what happens inside of Israel is what's important, inside of Israel proper, the 48 border, is what's important for the construction of our Jewish identities. But really, if we want to have a relationship with Israel, let's look at everyone living under Israeli authority.
Thanks. I'll just add one comment. I'm still fresh from my experience in Israel as an American diplomat, and I will say when you get away from the Knesset and the high politics and the real horrible invective that defines discourse on the issue you just pointed to, and you get down to the ground level, and you're into the world of shared society, Jewish, Arab shared society life, and attempts to improve it in Israel, or dialogue programs and people to people between Israelis, and Palestinians. What you find almost everywhere you go are Americans and American Jews. Entire communities like the San Francisco Jewish community, you find the American government often, and I was part of this, I'll gladly take the accusation, encouraged by American Jewry to use its own resources. There's a huge set aside in our aid budget for these kinds of programs. So it's a cutting edge of an evolving Israeli reality, and it's one where you really have a defining role that's being played by American Jewry, which is perhaps along the lines of what Rick was pointing to. He wants us in on every issue. Last question, and then we'll take some from everyone else. Something that Lauren raised, which is something we have to touch on. We're here on a university campus, is Hebrew. It's easy to understand 50 years ago when the vast majority of world Jewry didn't live in Israel. But today, however you do the numbers, close to a majority, but certainly the largest growing segment of world Jewry are people who speak Hebrew in their daily life. I'll ask each of you, if you choose to answer both or one of these two questions, why has Hebrew lagged? And I'm not just talking here about full literacy and full fluency, but why has Hebrew, whether it's familiarity with cultural trends in Israel, every Israeli child, if they don't know the name of the Israeli poet Zelda, they'll be able to recite a few lines from one of her poems that's used. Nobody would know the name here. Well, why has Hebrew persistently and consistently lagged in American Jewish life? And do you think it would, Sarah Ann may not like the way I define this question, but in terms of those who believe in the value proposition of trying to mitigate the divides within our communities between Israel and American Jewry, and you seek to strengthen unity, would better knowledge of Hebrew, more investment in Hebrew, help? Can we speak the same language? Would it help? I'll ask Shaul first, someone who I know has, this is something very unique, just so you know, I'll embarrass Shaul. His children are what's called in the, I'm not a linguist, but they're known as heritage speakers. They speak some degree of Hebrew, a very good degree of Hebrew, but not native fluency. And Shaul is not Israeli, but through this disciplined use of Hebrew in the home at early age, I think, if I'm right, you've created 2 children that are heritage speakers, even though they have no birth connection to Israel.
Yeah, until they broke me. I was about age 3 or 4, and they were only responding in English. Yeah, look, it depends on what the goals are, and so much of the conversation about the relationships between American Jews and Israel is happening on the political plane. There were visions of Zionism that were cultural visions, and I know that Haram was mentioned, but we should actually take a moment and think about that. Beyond the political symbolism of sovereignty and the like, one of the ideas was to create a space for Jewish cultural production, or more specifically for Hebrew language, for cultural production in Hebrew cultural production. And American Jews are able to consume music without translation, right? It's like a mantra. You can appreciate the sounds. It goes on violent underworld music. They're able to read literature in translation. They can watch Fode on Netflix now with Hebrew and Arabic, with subtitles. But they can watch Israeli film. There's a lot of culture that American Jews are able to consume. They're able to now get Bamba at Trader Joe, right, Joe's. And if you're not familiar with Bamba, that's a sign of a cultural gap. These are Israeli peanut butter flavored cheese puffs. But 90% of the Israeli homes eat this. Right. I heard 90%, but that could be Israeli Jewish. It's like some outrageously high.
I mean, I
Yeah.
it was 99.9.
All right. Oh, it's low. It's low. So the question is Hebrew language for what? And if for those people who are committed to some type of biculturalism, and I guess that's really where the issue of Hebrew fluency comes in. If your vision of what an ideal relationship between American Jews and Israel is that American Jews are bicultural, that they can go into Israel and not just have the tour guide say welcome home, but actually feel like they're at home in the sense that it's familiar to them, then Hebrew language is imperative. But by and large, that's not the mode that American Jews have ever chosen. And even in the whole debate over whether American Jews are distancing from Israel or not, and I don't think, I'm in the camp that I don't think that American Jews are distancing. But even if you were to accept that and look back to the post-67 moment as this peak, it was never about being bicultural. So if Hebrew wasn't, if we didn't do Hebrew then, we ain't doing it now.
We've crossed a tipping point. The majority of world Jewry speaks Hebrew, dreams in Hebrew, creates political discourse, cultural norms, negotiates marriage and divorce in Hebrew.
The majority of world Jewry speaks English as well. It's this
The vast majority.
You have to take into account American monolingualism as well. If we learn Spanish, then maybe we can add Hebrew as a third language. But until we get 2, we're not going to get the third.
Yeah, no, I'll put a different twist on what Saul said. Israelis are lucky that the other pole in the Jewish world is in America because we talked at lunch, they get the superpower relationship out of that, conspiracy theories aside. So they get a lot of good things out of the fact that this huge chunk of world Jewry lives in America. What they don't get is multilingualism. It's a shame they get a provincial monolingual group of co-ethnics. More Hebrew, Lauren, less Hebrew?
I mean, from a religious standpoint, I certainly am always an advocate of more Hebrew. I heard this story once, which I think is so beautiful, which is there was an exhibit at, it must have been the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and it was of Abraham leaving his father's house. And the English translation was, Abraham gets out from his father's home, and he leaves his father's home, and he goes to a land by which he doesn't know until God is going to show him. And there was a long sort of English explanation, and in the Hebrew it said, Lech Lecha. So, you know, I guess I teach a Friday morning Parsha study class, and I think to myself all the time, because many of the students are incredible and know the Torah backwards and forwards, but also many don't speak the language, and so are living in the translation of and always the question every Friday morning is, what does the Hebrew say? Every Friday morning, what does the Hebrew say? And I think sometimes, I think about that a lot in terms of cultural translation, of when you're entering somebody else's story, but you're entering it through, you know, a veil of translation. And how, you know, what does it mean to actually speak a language and be able to communicate with the mother tongue in a language that even the very way you communicate, right? It's that story of Lech Lecha, which means so much to us as we unpack that story in our minds, rather than having someone explain exactly what those two words actually mean. At the same time, I'll say, I think Jews over millennia have spoken many languages. And so whether we're talking about the Rambam, Maimonides, or we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud, which is written in Aramaic, or Yiddish, right? I think one of our wonderful challenges as a people is that we have become acculturated to the societies in which we've lived and have written in those languages and have, you know, beautifully gotten to know the poetry of the language with which we're living. And so I actually think it's on us and on myself as well, I think, to try to find our ways in through the language itself. I mean, I don't speak more than 2 languages, so but I do think, you know, we have a cantor who sings Yiddish and who speaks Yiddish, and I think her understanding of sort of the culture of what's happening in, you know, post-World War or, you know, pre-World War II in Eastern Europe, there's just a complete cultural understanding which is different than through a veil of translation.
So I love that, and I just want to affirm what the two of you said. So Hebrew for what, I think, is a hugely important question. And both of the things that you said. So one is Hebrew for what? Hebrew so that you have a tool into Jewish text. And so then it should be Hebrew and Aramaic. And then we should all have the opportunity to then, once you understand the tefillot, you probably will want to rewrite them. So we need to have some option also of where we take it moving forward, because I find a lot of American Jews are very attached to singing in Hebrew, singing prayers in Hebrew, because they have no idea what they mean. And if once they know what they mean, they are truly discomforted by them, as I think they should be. So that's one thing. But Hebrew for what? Hebrew so that you have an entry into this beautiful heritage that we have. And so the Hebrew for tools, Hebrew as a tool into this heritage. But the other piece is that we have, every language a Jew has written in is a Jewish language. How do we decide which language is more important? We have Judeo-Arabic, we have Ladino, we have Yiddish, we have so many different languages. In my lifetime, I'm not going to master all of them, but I want them all to be treasured and be held sacred, because these are languages in which Jews have been trying to figure out what it means to be a Jew in the world.
Thank you.
If I could just add one thing to build on that. And I don't think this is going to happen, but the rationale of Hebrew for what, for a connection with Israel, is that this is the language of the Jewish majority in Israel. And if you want to understand that culture, which is, along with the American Jewish community, one of the 2 largest Jewish communities in the world, then learn that language as well, and then you're not experiencing it in translation, and you get access to it in a way that you don't. And I think for me personally, that is a value choice that I made for me and for my family. And I also learned Yiddish in college to get access to that world, but I don't speak it, and I didn't go as much into I didn't have a living environment. So I think that there is a case to be made for it, but I don't, given our track record, I don't see any change where we're going to embrace it, where American Jews are going to embrace this, since we haven't really done it before.
Thanks. I mean, I would add to those lists, it's not a single purpose, there's no one answer, but if Rick was still here and from that podium, he would say one purpose for Hebrew is to do what he himself was doing last summer, late June, was to defend an agreement that he was part of the negotiation over the Kotel. He was, in that moment, trying to salvage it, and today would be defending it. And he sometimes conducts language interviews in Hebrew, and so he would perhaps put on your list one of the crudest possible purposes, which is to advocate and to help get outcomes, concrete political outcomes in Israel, because it's hard to advocate when you can't even project your voice in the language of political discourse. Let's talk Stephen Stern, a man of Hebrew letters and Jewish letters.
More Jewish letters than Hebrew.
I hope you were here. I hope you were here for the
I've been here most
for
of
the
the day.
advocacy for a cultural renaissance. Yeah, Stephen.
Look, the rubric of this conference has been distances between American Jews and Israeli Jews. You made a useful corrective, and there is different kinds of pluralisms within each, which are also fault lines within each. And one thing that strikes me is that along these fault lines, which is where the interesting dynamic lies, is relationship with others, with other families. I mean, you raised the world of Palestine, with which I work, which is an important one, but also assimilation in the US. Any number of issues that Israelis deal with in bringing together Jews from all kinds of different cultures. There is this American Jews and we'll say Israeli Jews for now, it should be broader, who deal with these relationships with broader families recently. How much is this tearing us apart? Are there ways that this can be useful in terms of bringing us together? That's my question.
Maybe we'll, with Yoram's permission, can we collect 2 or 3 and tally? And if you have a loud voice, you can shout from your chair or come to the microphone. Sure.
Thank you. It's a great panel. Thank you, Scott. So actually I want to kind of maybe, I don't know, turn it around. But what about Israelis living in the United States? And maybe reflecting in the synagogue life and social life. I mean, you would think that the Jewish community would be the first place that they would run to and go to the synagogue and try and find a home there. And I feel like that is not happening. And actually, they're finding less in common with the Jewish American community than they do with other immigrant communities that are coming to the US from different countries. So if you can reflect on that and how that maybe affects the relationship, how it could affect the relationship of the Jewish community with Israel.
You know, it's an excellent question. I don't know, is Nadine still here? Nadine brought up earlier the question of are Israelis, which the demography, maybe Shaul knows more, but after ultra-Orthodox Jewish Americans, Israeli Jewish Americans are the fastest growing demographic group, I think I've read, in American Jewish life. If you look on the census, I won't give you the answer, go to the census website. It's a wonderful place for those of you who are prone to distraction or just love data. And you can click around, and it's very easy to find the list of all languages, second languages, spoken in homes in the United States. And I'll give you all a homework assignment. Click on the tab and find out how many US households speak Hebrew, which is a fascinating statistic. We'll just do one more question, and we'll do a round, and we'll answer all 3 of them.
By the way, I'm also a heritage speaker.
Can you just introduce yourself?
I'm Ira Weiss. I'm also a heritage speaker of Hebrew, mostly with a strong Tanakhi style. And I got to tell you that when I go to Israel and I have long conversations in Hebrew, it's not long into that where everyone tells me, speak English. So you have to understand, Israelis speak English. That's the other part of the picture. But I'd like your response to this. I had dinner the other night with somebody from Israel, from Neve Shalom, who was at the J Street conference. And someone asked her what she thought of the J Street conference. And her comment was, Well, I'll tell you, there was only 10 people there, so she could be frank, I think. Almost no women, almost no Israelis of color, almost no Israelis of color. She was the only one, and she's only half Mizrahi. No Dasim, no settlers. She said it was all white, white, secular, Chiloni, Tel Avivniks, the very people who most Israelis, who are people of color and Dasim and settlers and so on, who most Israelis feel dissed by, who feel totally. And her point was, if this were really an American conference about an American topic, that never would have happened. There would have been planning for diversity. There would have been women. There would have been people of color, and so on. So I think it's a flip side of some of the stuff you've said.
Yeah, let's first one point of order. I don't work at J Street, but I did meet 4 members of Knesset. I was there last week. All 4 of them were women. I don't know how many were there, but if you just looked at the Knesset caucus, they were all women. But Ira's question, Tali's and Stevens, do each of you maybe want to take one, or you all want to chime in? Who wants to go first? Pluralism, Israelis. How do we ensure, maybe we'll linger on the Israelis for just a minute. I feel actually kind of close to it. I grew up in Southern California. If you weren't a traditional American Jew, you were Israeli, Yordim, and they all blended in. And we see signs today that they're not. In fact, I'll give one anecdote if you don't mind. My family just moved back from Israel 3 years, and my children are very little and sort of think of themselves as little Israeli people. And the oldest is in the Tzofim, so we land here in America and we move to Washington, back to Washington, and there's a Tzofim chapter. So we take our, scouts, the Israeli scouts, boys and girls together. It's not like gender segregated like in America. And my 10-year-old, for whom the Tzofim was really his sort of favored identity. We live in a world of multiple identities. Love that uniform. Didn't like it. Went twice, 3 times. Didn't like it. Why? Because they're all kids that live in Rockville and go to the same elementary school. It's called not Parkland. Who knows the name? It's called sorry, I apologize. Farmland, and they say it, of course, with an Israeli accent. Farmland. Washington Israelis are some of the most. It seems to be the most. Yoram aside, some of the most ghettoized. Do we need to do a better job recruiting Israeli Americans to get back into Jewish American life?
I'm having such a hard time with it. It's such a good question. I think sometimes I've been thinking about how Ashkenazi-centric we are in, I'm just thinking about Addis itself, and how we've been trying to sort of grow in how we think about what community is, what we're offering, how one of the things we do, because it's a 1,600 family community, so it's big, are to create micro communities. And what does that look like? Where sometimes that is around social action and issues, sometimes that's around children, the age of, if there are families that have children, sometimes that's around minyanim, and there are multiple minyanim within the synagogue. But I also think that lately we've been talking about identity, and people who are coming from, we have a large South American contingent of people who grew up in Mexico and in Peru, and wanting to speak Spanish together, and what foods look like in that way. And I think we haven't done enough of a good job on what does that mean for Israelis that are living in America. I just think it's a good challenge.
I'll put you on the spot. How many members of the synagogue do you have? It's a big synagogue.
It's around 3,500 people.
How many of those are Israeli, or would you classify?
Do
you even count?
No, I don't know what our percentage is. It's a great question. I don't know. It's a really good challenge.
The other 2 questions, or just this one? Do either of you want to speak about Israeli Americans or the other?
Well, I have 2 thoughts on these questions, and I didn't quite understand your question about assimilation.
Stevens or Iris?
The notions are fault lines between Jews in different places have a lot to do with relating to people who are outside the Jewish families, relating to other families, the impact that has.
So I'm going to reflect back to you what I think I just understood, because I think that you're partly answering these questions, actually, which is that what you're saying is that Jews live in the contexts in which they live. more than in the context of a closed, insular Jewish family or, right. So I think that that's the thing that we have been talking about this whole time, right? Jews speak many languages. Israelis come here and they have more in common with other immigrants than they do with American Jews. Why? Material conditions matter. To be an immigrant is an experience unto itself that is unique, that gives you more in common than something that you theoretically share with other Jews. I think that that's, so I think that, okay, so now I have thoughts on all three of you, but I'll be quick. So one is that I think that the context absolutely matters, and that we are each of us in each of our communities is shaped in terms of the others that we face all the time. One of the interesting overlays or a sort of parallel is that the American anti-racist discourse is so important that young Jews are taking this way, the way in which they are raised to be anti-racist, and they're going to Israel and they are becoming transformed. And I have seen this with so many young Jews I have spent time with and who report about their experiences in Israel, where the anti-racist lens that they have inherited or been socialized into as Americans then plays out in how they see what happens on the streets in Israel with Palestinians, with asylum seekers, with migrant workers. And they look at things in terms of discrimination, exploitation, exclusion, white supremacy. Young people are now talking about Israel as a white supremacist state, and that's young Jews talking about Israel. I'm not talking about Richard Spencer, who everybody knows, right? Richard Spencer looks at Israel as the model for the kind of America he wants. Look, you actually achieved what we're trying to achieve, right? It's horrifying. So there's this moment, this way in which...
That doesn't mean he's right, but...
It doesn't mean he's right, but it does mean that when he said this to a Hillel rabbi, my understanding is that the rabbi was stunned into silence, because Israel does privilege Jews over non-Jews. So what do you want to do with that? Where are you going to take it? How are you going to own it? How are you going to be accountable for it? It's something that we have to talk about. And so this is something that has shaped American Jews so deeply that young Jews are now taking this to Israel and coming back and joining If Not Now or JVP, or we didn't talk about how many young Jews are in the BDS movement, or then there is what is probably the largest numbers of young Jews, which are the ones who are completely opting out. They look and they see that to touch Israel or Palestine on campus means to be involved in a strident confrontational debate. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They just back out. They have their own private lives, not their public, collective lives. That's one thing, if I may quickly answer the other two. So I think also what Lauren said about American Jews having their heads in the dream and not being prepared to engage the reality of Israel is probably something that happens when Israelis come and meet American Jews who don't know about the realities of Israel and are stuck in the dream. And how do these people relate? They may speak the same words, but they're missing each other in terms of understanding what they're actually talking about. And then the last piece is that I think that there's a question we could ask. Is so much of Israel and of Israeli culture is based on conquering the diaspora within, the diasporic within each of us, the diasporic Jew. And so then Israelis come here, and who are we? We're the diasporic Jews, right? My grandparents came from shtetls, and I'm not embarrassed about that. Though when I lived in Israel in my teens and 20s, on many occasions I was in positions where I was asked to be embarrassed and ashamed that was my background, and I didn't disavow it. So there's something there, I think. I don't know how far it goes. I haven't done research on this, but I would actually be really curious about, we use the language of internalized anti-Semitism. How much is there sort of Israelis looking at American Jews and saying, first of all, you missed the fight of the century, and second of all, your people are the ones who chose money over honor. And then the very last thing that I would say is that we silo our issues. And I think it's a shame. I heard that also about J Street, that there was basically one Mizrahi speaker, or one speaker speaking about Mizrahi issues, which is also wrong, that if there is one Mizrahi speaker, that she has to then speak about Mizrahi issues, right? And I think that, and And J Street in particular, J Street is Washington politics. Washington politics is male-dominated. American Jewish life is primarily male-dominated, and white, there's a class of people. It's education, it's a certain kind of education, it's white, male, Ashkenazi. And it's a shame that we are missing this opportunity to look at the full breadth of Israeli society and to say that to actually do transformations is going to require, and is an invitation to work across many social movements. And we're at a moment with a great growth in Mizrahi organizing inside of Israel. Mizrahi visibility, Mizrahi demands. It's a really interesting moment. How great, what an opportunity for American Jews to learn what those real and living issues are for those Israelis. And so the last point that I'll make is that if we want to engage with Israel more, and I think that we do, that we want to fully engage with what is alive in Israeli society. And those social movements across the board are part of what is alive in Israeli society.
So briefly, just on this, on the Richard Spencer point, I think there's one thing that I think we should understand. When he was saying that to the Hillel rabbi, he was poking. You see, you are just like us. And so it's
Where was this?
This is so this is not, he's not a neutral observer, and he was doing this as a way of sticking it to Jews. It was an assault, and it should be recognized as that.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm not.
No, I know that
I'm not
you're
in
right.
that
But I just
camp.
want to make sure that
Take that man's
right,
mic
yeah,
away.
got it, right.
First, because he may be right.
No, well, listen, but
You know, if it was obvious that he was wrong. The reason this point, because people do think there is something to what he said.
well, I'll just invoke another white, because
sorry,
when
I-
Rabbi
yeah,
Jacobs
you're
walked into the room. It's not always done in a way to assault. I mean, Governor Huckabee, who was a leader of the evangelical community, invade his expertise of Israel, which is paper thin after the Parkland shootings. If anyone remembered, said, you know, what we need in America, we need what Israel has, which is, you know, access to guns and armed schools and limits. And he was speaking from a profound place of ignorance. So, you know, it's coming at us from different directions. It's not always hostile. Sometimes it's laudatory, but misguided and misdirected.
But in Spencer's case, it was not done out of love for Jews. Just on Israeli Americans, so I did a study of Birthright Israel, and in addition to the Americans or the diaspora Jews who participate, Israeli Jews participate as well. And one of the common themes that you'll hear from the Israelis who participate was, we never saw our country like this. So their own Israelis' understandings of their own country, it's not symbolic. There are symbolic dimensions, but they're not relating to it as a symbol in a way that American Jews do. And so they're coming into a Jewish community that understands a place that they came from and that they know in all of its texture and complexity, reduced to a symbol, and there's an inherent disconnect in
Let
that.
me just put you, Shaul, who I've known forever, doesn't like to be put on the spot. Lauren said, effectively, we need to open up our institutions more to Israelis. Maybe we're missing something. I think that's what you said. Do you think, Shaul, because you look at a lot of, and you study a lot of American Jewish institutions, should more be done to sort of bring them in? I mean, is something being missed?
Yes, yeah, something should be done, but Israeli Americans are self-organizing as well. And, you know, and I think that, and rather than try to remake Israeli immigrants in a native-born Ashkenazi American Jewish image, one of the things that American Jewish institutions can do is to help create the space for Israeli Americans to create the type of Jewish life that speaks to them and
So
works for them.
that's actually how I would use the language, because I think as opposed to what feels to me the last kind of 10 years have been about in American Jewish life, about how do we get them in, which to me feels like such the wrong way of approaching Jewish life, of like, I actually think it's how do we make space? How do we make space for people to find themselves within a common tent, right? So are there spaces within American synagogue life for Israeli Jews of many different, the pluralism that each brings with them, because Israeli Jews is such a, Israeli Jews is doesn't actually give the threads that are individuals and how they're, what they're bringing here. And so I actually think it's making space for that to emerge as a community within community. And that's, I think, that's one of my jobs. That's one of our jobs.
We'll take two last questions. I apologize, I'm getting the hook here, the gentleman here, and we'll go to the back row. And some of us are sticking around. In fact, all the panel committed to be here for another little while. So there's a few of you, including here in the back, if we can kind of caucus on the side and have an informal discussion. We'll take it off air. I used to be in the radio business. We'll do the third and fourth and fifth questions off air. Here, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Howard Marks. I'm a member of AUDIS, and kudos to the panel. Did a great job, including my own rabbi, Lauren Holtzblatt. So my question is, you know, we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of Israel. It's a huge event, the recreation of the Third Commonwealth. And what are we talking about? We're talking about Natalie Portman. I don't know how many times Natalie Portman's name has been mentioned today, but quite a few, including the head of the Reform movement.
Well, two more times than it was before.
Okay, so my question is, you know, we've had Adam Shapiro, we've had a whole thing, and, you know, how do we get back to the big picture? I mean, here, you know, Israel has its faults, obviously, as Rabbi Holtzblatt said, it's, you know, the human condition, so to speak. You know, how do we get back to this is the great last refuge for Jews? And I've been to Lithuania last April, and I saw how even the Jewish remnant there and Latvia are so tied into Israel. How do we get back to the big picture of this miracle of the recreation after 2,000 years of a Jewish state in the Levant? Thank you.
Good, easy question. And in the back here, is there a microphone? Or you can either shout or Avis will bring you the second to last row in the aisle. And if you could introduce yourself, thank you.
I lived in Israel in
What's your name, by the way?
Carol Hillman. I lived in Israel in 1965 for a long time. I know the language, I know the people, I know the land. Assimilation was always the problem. My sister married a Moroccan, tremendous assimilation problems. And I think when Israelis come to America, especially the Israelis that work at the NIH in this area, I don't think they assimilate. I don't think they want to. They stick with the Israelis, and they've had a completely different upbringing. The women have been in the army. They're different. I think it's very, very difficult to have Israelis mix with Americans. It's different if they come here and they stay here for 30 years. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about people that come here for a short period of time, 6, 7, 8 years, and they truly, I think I'm probably right in that respect. Would you not agree?
Well, of course, we know they all just come for a few years initially, right? We're going to sneak in a question. I'm being lobbied. Marcia, where are you? Yes. Sorry. Of course, I know Marcia. Please.
Thank you.
But I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm Marcia Rosenblatt, and I teach modern Jewish history here at the University of Maryland. I have just a comment about language. I couldn't resist wanting to make a comment, and then I'll ask a little question, which is a big question. The comment about language is actually about Hebrew and other languages. Probably the main reason American Jews don't know Hebrew is because they're Americans, and Americans are very lazy about learning other languages, right? That's what the person sitting next to me wrote down in her notes too. And so, you know, people just don't learn it. It's not an ideological thing, it's just that they don't learn it. But people become attached to their languages, and all sorts of languages become Jewish languages. One of the chief Jewish languages of the 20th century was German. German was a Jewish language. And I knew people when I was growing up whose parents had emigrated from Germany, emigrated, they were refugees from Germany, and when they heard German, they assumed whoever was speaking was Jewish, because German was a Jewish language. So we have to remember that, you know, that also, not just Yiddish and Ladino and Judeo or Arabic, which are clearly Judaic languages, but also the languages that you speak, German, Polish, Arabic, English, French, you know, become Jewish languages. Okay, the question though is, what is the biggest divide between American Jews and Israelis? Is it religion? Is it politics? I mean, is it culture in general? Well, you know, what is the biggest divide? Or maybe there isn't a biggest divide. Maybe it's a lot of little divides, but What is the biggest divide?
Well, at least according to the Pew survey, which Dov Waxman and others have referenced, at least as far as I remember, the biggest divide was on whether a sense of humor, a good sense of humor, is part of one's Jewish identity. I don't work for Pew. I thought it was the most idiotic aspect of their survey, but that's where the numbers are. American Jews, the numbers were, does anyone remember this? High, like 40% or something, part of my Jewish...
The highest was social justice, as your definition of Judaism, was like 69%, and the next, I think, was a sense of humor.
Sense of humor. Israelis, it was in the single digits on sense of humor, because they know. Each of you get to answer one of those three questions, if you'd like, or comment, or say a final comment. And Yoram and the staff of the Institute have prepared a reception, I believe, for everyone. Should I make an announcement? Where will that be, Avis? Right here?
That's correct.
Right here in this room. So please don't run away. We'll have lots of off-air discussions.
All right, so yeah, I'll take a crack at final comments. On the biggest divide, it's probably where the locus of Jewishness is. Is this about individuals and identity, right? And here in the States, we've psychologized it. People talk about the sociology of American Jews, and it's great that we have two sociologists up here. But the social science of American Jews is now largely a field of social psychology because it's all about identity. It's a very individualistic way of thinking about Jewishness. And it's not just that Israel is a state, collectivist alike, it's that Zionism thinks about Jewishness in collective terms and in political terms, and everything follows from that, and American Jews generally have never really adopted that approach, which goes back to why I was saying before, American Jews are very pro-Israel and not really Zionist. On the point that you made, I'll say amen, and you know, we tend to get caught up. Maybe it's that we have a sense of humor and angst, and we prefer angst over actually stepping back and hakarat tov, recognizing the good. I think it's really, really important to do. You know, we have times when we can deal with the angst. There are moments when there should be moments for pure, unadulterated celebration. You know, so I will leave you with this: 2 kilos of lamb, 4 cloves of garlic, 2 small onions, 3 tablespoons of basil, about a whole head of Italian parsley, some olive oil, salt, pepper, cumin to taste, and grill them up for about 5 minutes. Okay?
We're coming over.
Thank you, Shaul. And thank you for not mentioning Natalie Portman in your answer.
I actually really appreciate the Natalie Portman story because I think each thing that we have talked about is a microcosm and is a really important and rich opportunity for us to unpack all of the different layers that are involved, and we can draw out from each of those the larger story that we think is happening here. And I'm going to say that as an introduction to give my answer to your question as I think I understand it, and I sort of snuck in here because I actually don't want my word to be the last word of the panel, because we'll wait till you hear what I'm going to say. So I don't know what the biggest divide is, but I know that the polls show us that American Jews are, by and large, Democrats, and American Jews, by and large, are liberal and believe in liberal democracy, and they rank civil rights and equal rights for all citizens as top of their list of what is important in a country. And we know, because we just mentioned it, that the Pew report, and I'm remembering 69%, I could be wrong, that the number one piece of content of Jewish identity for American Jews is an idea of social justice. So that's American Jews. If we look at the polls of Israeli Jews, the fastest and largest and steepest growing numbers are those who want to deny civil rights and equal rights to all those who are actually citizens of their country. There are growing numbers of people who actually want to take away rights. They're not equal, but they do exist, take away rights from Palestinian citizens of Israel. And we know, of course, that there are millions of people who live under Israeli rule without citizenship. So we could say that the greatest divide here is what priority do you put on your government providing civil and human rights protections to all people who live under your government's authority? And American Jews and Israeli Jews come down on two very opposite sides of that question.
Lauren?
So I also want to say I'm Maine to Howard. I see it in my own kids. I see it in our kids at Addis. We send 25 kids a year. Our high schoolers are 10th graders to Israel in the summer, and it's just a miracle. It's a miracle to see Jews practicing sovereignty. It's a miracle for our kids to grow up with an identity of security. I think that allows questioning in ways that one couldn't do in decades prior, and I think that's an amazing thing to celebrate, which is why we say a full Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut in our davening. I want to say this about the largest divide, because I'm not sure what it is, to be honest, but something I think about a lot in religious life is this concept of mirroring. What do I mean by that? I want to say two things about it. I think one is, I spoke about it earlier, of, if you see yourself as a potential reflected in the community that you're visiting, or you find yourself there, right? You go to Israel, you see something that looks like you, that feels like you, that feels like home, you feel like you could be at home, a sort of mirroring. And I often think that within religious life, and just within cultural life, we don't make enough room for exploration. We think if I don't see a mirror of myself, or of my politics, or of my religious way of life, or of my cultural identity, I can't, there's nothing here for me. And I think one thing, because I feel this oftentimes, the texts that I spend the most time in were not written by women, and were not written for women. And I spend enormous amounts of time in them, whether they're Hasidic texts from the 17th to 19th centuries, which is where I spend a lot of my time, or in Talmudic texts. And I often think to myself, I'm going into a land, meaning a textual land, that is not the language that is my mother tongue, and is also not a language not a book that was written for me as a woman. But what am I gonna learn when I go into that land? What am I gonna hear about the conversations that are happening? What are things that I now have access to that, my women before me never would have had access to? And how can I be a traveler in this land, even though this particular land wasn't built for me? And though the state of Israel was, had me in mind when it was built, what does it mean that I don't own it? I don't feel the sense of it's only for me. And what might it mean to be a traveler in that place without feeling that I own every corner and crevice, but that I'm both a traveler in that land, and there's a space for me there. Both of those things at the same time. I both get to be a traveler there, and I also potentially can find a home there without it mirroring exactly who I am. And I think sometimes we get stuck in those places of when it doesn't look exactly like me, I feel a divide, and it feels like it's growing bigger. And how might we spiritually, religiously, culturally, politically stretch ourselves to being able to see the other as a way of finding ourselves more?
Thank you. That was beautifully said. I think there was a joke in the earlier panel about arguing maybe is the essence of Judaism. I forget if it was Avi or someone else. I would say in all seriousness, rejecting fatalism and tinkering and intervening, it's obviously the cutting edge of Zionism, but Jewish life is about trying to define a future and intervening, and we've spent time on this panel, and I think all day, trying to come up with ways to tinker, adjust, fix the system, and not just fall prey to fatalism in these relationships. So I thank all of you for your contributions, and join me in thanking you.